My previous video, Crises Simplified, is a primer for this video. If you watch it first, this video will make a lot more sense. I'd like to talk about crises in more detail. To do this, I'm going to use economic complexity as a metric for measurement. I want to demonstrate why, though. Here is the gross domestic product in the U.S. since 1950, with only the dollar amount considered. There are no adjustments made in this plot. I got this from the Fed office in St. Louis. There's a link to the article in the description. Notice that all it is an upward trend. Here is the gross domestic product in the U.S. since 1961, with several adjustments made. I got this from macrotrends.net. There's a link to the article in the description. Notice that there's a lot more flux, showing the ups and downs of the business cycle and an overall downward trend. This paints a very different picture when considering the complexity of the economy. Let's get into some of the details. The fiscal cliff you see here is the recession happening in the early 80s. I'm pretty sure that this is a spike in the property boom in the mid-80s, but I'm not entirely sure. This is the Black Monday crash of '87. This is the dot-com bubble of 2000. It's also important to remember that 9/11 happened in 2001, and the destruction of the World Trade Center had a significant impact as well. This is the housing bubble of 2008. The reason that it was so severe is because of how influential the mortgage-backed securities are in the derivatives market. This is a story that goes back to the 70s, where the data gets much more interesting. But first, this is probably the pandemic. This trough in the mid-70s is referred to as a period of economic stagnation. There was also a lot of inflation occurring, so some refer to it as stagflation. This is interesting because it's not a market bubble bursting. What's more interesting is the increase in complexity of the derivatives market from the 70s on. The derivatives market was responding to the end of what is referred to as the post-World War II expansion. When the expansion came to a close, the economic growth slowed, and the derivatives market began responding with creating more money-making complexity. In the late 70s, that was the mortgage-backed security. That led to the property boom and eventually to the housing bubble. Let's talk about how the expansion happened. I use many types of growth in analysis, but right now I just want to talk about vertical and horizontal growth. Vertical growth is where the established complexity or existing markets and businesses are making more profits. During World War II, government contracts were making businesses and thus their employees more money. This was following a very severe depression where a lot of established complexity was lost, and so there was a lot of room for economic growth. Horizontal growth is where the complexity itself grows. This is the economy gaining new markets and/or businesses and better distributing the wealth. Following World War II, the addition of the new small businesses resulted in the strong middle class of the 50s and 60s. Those small businesses thus became established complexity that was lost later on as businesses began beating them on price points due to being able to deal in more bulk. The efficiency of the corporate model thus began to turn horizontal growth into faux vertical growth with the loss of that established complexity. This continues into the current startup culture, where startups take the risk upon themselves for research and development and aspire to be acquired by a large company. This is where potential for horizontal growth is deferred to vertical growth. This has aggregated the markets in that there are now far fewer businesses making far much more money. This means that the wealth has been aggregated as well. The decline of the middle class has been a consequence of this. This window of time here represents where the derivatives market began to adapt to slowing economic growth. This was not a feature of the business cycle. This was a feature of the overarching crisis cycle. If the crisis cycle were represented as a sine wave, which is just a wave that has smooth curves in its peaks and valleys, one instance of it would be represented as a bell curve. The first half would represent the positive growth, and the last half would represent the negative growth or decline. The first quarter, rapid growth. The second quarter, slowing growth. The third quarter, decline, and the fourth quarter, collapse. The first 3 quarters are based on data concerning what has already happened. The fourth quarter is a projection based on historic trends tempered with existing data. The fourth quarter is what we think we can expect to happen. The beginning of the curve represents the early to mid-40s, where the economy was recovering. From there, the room for growth allowed the rapid growth that followed. Where the bell curve interacts with the end of the first quarter represents about 1970. This is where the economic growth began to slow and the derivatives market began to adapt with increases in money-making complexity. Where the curve interacts with the end of the second quarter represents about the turn of the century, where growth maximized with e-commerce. Where the curve intersects with the end of the third quarter represents about now, where destabilization is becoming critical. Loss of established complexity, aggregation of wealth and markets, cutting costs in critical complexity, carrying valueless derivatives, and many other issues are now putting the economy at heightened risk for collapse. The dysfunction that is being observed can result in a chain reaction via the complexity of the supply chains, where one industry having a catastrophic failure can affect many other industries that in turn affect many other industries. This is also a worldwide issue, as partnerships abroad are pathways to spread the crisis, as observed in the housing bubble of '08. The end of the curve represents the end of the crisis, where recovery and growth begins again. With our current resources, the collapse could run its course in as little as a couple to a few years. This is just a little more in-depth discussion of how economic crises happen. Post-Great Depression United States is a fine example of how the modern economic model rises and falls. This is a crop from a screening from Twitter trends. The end of the crisis cycle is being referred to as an everything bubble. I wouldn't put all the influence on the Fed though. Growth maximizing economic policy, overpowered big businesses, and the nearly 100-year-old consumerist model that led to the current macroeconomics and many other issues resulted in this repeat of history. It's likely that an economic model that is modeled in anticipation of crises is required to solve for them. It's probably the case that rigid growth maximization results in downtime that has a negative effect on the more long-term growth. The rigidity of growth incentives seems to be the most influential factor in the propagation of crises.